Hey guys, thanks for tuning into my channel where we explore the hidden history of our world as most overlooked and misunderstood civilizations. Today we're going to take a look at the fascinating but somewhat controversial theory that it was actually the Tartars who were responsible for the Great Wall of China. And if this is true, what does it mean for our understanding of history? Let's get started. So, before we get into the juicy stuff about the Great Wall of China, we need to talk about these random ass Tartarians. Who are they and why do they keep popping up in all these videos? The name Tartaria comes from an old term used by Europeans during the Middle Ages to describe the nomadic tribes living east of Poland and Russia. They were known for their horseback riding skills and their distinct style of clothing. Now, back then, Europeans didn't really have a good map of Asia, so they thought that Tartary was a huge empire stretching from one side of the continent to the other. But in reality, it was just a bunch of small, loosely connected tribes. Still, the Europeans were pretty scared of them. They thought that Tartary had a massive army, and they kept trying to invade Poland and Russia. So the people living in these areas built a giant wall to keep them out. But wait a second. We all know that the Great Wall of China was built to keep the Mongols out, not the Tartars. Well, here's where things get a little weird because up until recently, it was widely believed that the Tartars and the Mongols were the same thing. In fact, the word Mongol was actually a self-reference used by the nomadic tribes themselves, while the name Tartars was used by outsiders. However, new research suggests that these two groups were actually quite different. For example, recent genetic studies have shown that the Mongols were actually more closely related to the Chinese people they were fighting against than they were to the other nomadic tribes. This has led some historians to believe that the Mongols were actually more of a Chinese creation, a way for the Chinese government to control the people living along the edges of their empire. Now, this may sound crazy, but there is evidence to support this theory. For example, the Mongols had a very centralized government, which was very unusual for nomadic tribes. They also had a written language, and they kept detailed records of their history. These are things that the other nomadic tribes did not do. It's possible that the Mongols were influenced by the Chinese culture that surrounded them, and that's why they were more like the Chinese people they were fighting against. Okay, so if the Mongols weren't fighting off the Tartars, who were those mysterious horsemen behind the Great Wall? Well, this is where things start to get really confusing because nobody knows for sure. Some people believe that it was the Xiongnu people, while others believe it was the Xianbai people. There are also some people who believe that it was actually the Tartars, but not the ones we talked about earlier. No, there was another group of Tartars that lived even further east in Mongolia. But unfortunately, we don't have much information about them because most of the records were written by the Chinese and they tend to paint the Tartars in a bad light. According to the Chinese, the Tartars were a warlike people who were always trying to invade their territory. But this may not be true. It is possible that the Chinese were just making up stories about the Tartars in order to justify their actions. After all, the Chinese were the ones who built the wall, and they were the ones who kept attacking the nomadic tribes. So it makes sense that they would want to make themselves look like the good guys. This is where things get really interesting. What if the truth is that the Tartars were the ones who built the wall? After all, they were the only group of people living in the area who had the technology and the manpower to do such a thing. The other groups, such as the Xiongnu and the Xianbai, simply didn't have the resources to build something like the Great Wall. But why would the Tartars have wanted to build a wall in the first place? Were they trying to protect themselves from the Chinese, or were they trying to keep the Chinese out? Well, the answer to this question may surprise you. In recent years, some historians have begun to argue that the Tartars were just some savage nomads. They had a rich culture and a complex society with its own unique traditions and customs. In fact, they argue that the Tartars were actually quite advanced for their time. They had a sophisticated understanding of engineering and mathematics, and they were skilled astronomers and navigators. In fact, some historians believe that the Tartars were the first people in the world to use gunpowder and that they were also responsible for inventing the compass. If this is true, then it makes sense that they would have been able to build the Great Wall. They had the knowledge and the skills necessary to do it. They just needed the manpower. So how did the Tartars get the manpower to build the wall? Some historians believe that they were actually able to unite all of the nomadic tribes in the region under one banner. This would have given them a massive army of soldiers who could then be used to build the wall. Other historians believe that the Tartars didn't need an army to build the wall. Instead, they simply forced the people living inside the wall to do the work for them. This may sound cruel, but this was actually a common practice among nomadic tribes. They would often enslave the people they conquered and then force them to work for them. The Tartars may have done the same thing. They may have conquered the people living inside the wall and then forced them to build it. But who are these Tartars? Was it the same group that attacked the Romans in Europe? Or was it a different group entirely? Well, this is where things start to get really confusing. The truth is that we don't know for sure who the Tartars were. The only information we have about them comes from the Chinese and the Europeans, and neither of them gave us a very clear picture. The Chinese described the Tartars as savage nomads who were always trying to invade their territory. The Europeans, on the other hand, described the Tartars as fierce warriors who were known for their skill in horseback riding. They also said that the Tartars were highly organized and disciplined, and that they had a strong sense of community and loyalty. They also described the Tartars as having a deep respect for nature and the environment. This is in stark contrast to the Chinese description of the Tartars. It makes you wonder if the Tartars were actually a peaceful people who were simply trying to live in harmony with the natural world. But when the Chinese came along and started encroaching on their land, the Tartars were forced to fight back. The Great Wall is just one example of this conflict between the Chinese and the Tartars. There are many other examples too. For example, the Battle of the River, where the Tartars defeated the Chinese and forced them to retreat. This shows that the Tartars were not weak and helpless. They were fierce warriors who were willing to stand up for themselves. It also shows that the Chinese were not as powerful as they thought they were. They were actually afraid of the Tartars. Another piece of evidence that the Tartars were not weak is the fact that they were able to survive for so long in such a harsh environment. The area where the Tartars lived is very cold and dry. It's not a very hospitable place to live, but the Tartars managed to survive there for hundreds of years. This shows that they were resourceful and adaptable people who were able to make the best of a bad situation. And finally, the last piece of evidence that the Tartars were not weak is the fact that they were able to resist the Chinese for so long. The Chinese were a much more powerful empire than the Tartars. They had a bigger population, more resources, and a stronger military. Yet the Tartars were able to hold out against them for centuries. This shows that the Tartars were brave and determined people who were not going to give up easily. The Great Wall of China is a testament to the power and determination of the Tartars. It's a reminder that they were not weak and helpless people, but rather fierce warriors who were willing to stand up for themselves. It's also a reminder that the Chinese were not as powerful as they thought they were. In fact, they were afraid of the Tartars and their military might. As we continue to learn more about the Tartars, we will undoubtedly find more evidence to add to this list. Their story is an important one that should not be forgotten. Thanks for watching. Hey, real quick before you go, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more just like it, do me a favor and click that little subscribe button down below. I promise to see you next time,